Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. The first few terms of the dependent origination are because of ignorance, volitional formations, because of volitional formations, consciousness, because of consciousness, name and form. So I'd like to look at this sequence a little more closely in this talk. There's a lot of important Dhamma concepts in that initial sequence. Begin with ignorance, avidya, which is usually given as the first term of the dependent origination. As explained in the Visuddhimagga, it's given as the first term for purposes of exposition only, not ultimately, because it's a cycle. It goes around and around, so there is no really first term ultimately. But ignorance is a good place to start explaining the dependent origination. And it is, in another sense, it is truly the root of all conditioned existence. Not knowing, not seeing. And it's something that remains with us until full awakening. Only an arahant or a Buddha is beyond ignorance. So all the rest of us have some degree of ignorance in our makeup. So one of the things to take from this is to have some humility, realize you don't know everything, you can't know everything, that your view is necessarily incomplete, that we're doing the best we can, but we don't have the full understanding, we don't have the full picture. Ajahn Chah often talked about mane. It's a Thai phrase that means a recognition of uncertainty. It's a colloquial phrase, so it's not easy to translate exactly, but it's something like a shrug of the shoulders and a whatever, who knows, not sure. Yeah, I think not sure is a common translation that's been settled on. And that's a recognition that we are ignorant. We don't know. And if we pretend we have all the answers, that's when we get into trouble. You have to recognize our own uncertainty and operate from that position. Which is not to say that we should be satisfied or content with ignorance. We should be always striving to gain more wisdom, which is seeing things in their own nature as they actually are. And not being content with superficial appearances or made up views and opinions, but to try and see things in their own nature as they actually are. This is the essence of vipassana, clear seeing. That we're equanimous and non-reactive and just taking each Dhamma as it arises and knowing its nature. And this is a way to begin to unravel ignorance. Ignorance is particularly defined in the dependent origination as ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. So not seeing suffering, the cause of suffering, the end of suffering, and the path leading to the end of suffering. And fully seeing the Four Noble Truths is the same as awakening. Ignorance is truly the last, it's the first and the last. It's the first defilement because it's the root of everything else. And it's the last defilement to go. If anyone has not read Ajahn Mahabua's talk, it's one of the last talks he gave. I don't know if it's the last talk he gave, but it's close to the end of his life. He gave this talk that became very famous. And it's been translated into English, and you can find it on the web easily enough. It's Arahata Magga Arahata Pala, where he talks about his own enlightenment. If you haven't read it, I would recommend you find it, and it's pretty short, and give it a read. It's very interesting and illuminating. It's actually a Vinaya offense for him to be openly proclaiming his arahantship, but I suppose that he's an arahant near the end of his life. I mean, who cares about a Pachidia offense? Let's let it go. And he talks about, in his meditation, having an experience of brilliant white light and holding on to that for a long time as being, that was enlightenment, that was full awakening, and holding on to it. And then he realized with this kind of ferocious nature of no, this is not the truth. And he penetrated that and realized Nibbana. And he says that brilliant white light, which is actually the goal of a lot of mystic traditions, the brilliant white light is the last manifestation of ignorance. It is itself ignorance. Saying it's the last manifestation is another way of, from another angle, you could say it's the first. It's the most subtle emanation of samsara, the brilliant white light, and then everything congeals out of that, all the manifestation of all the various forms. But the purest form of samsaric existence, he perceived as this brilliant white light, and it was itself ignorance because it's missing the unconditioned. So that's how subtle it gets. And because of ignorance, we're conditioned, more correctly or technically say, not because of, but conditioned by ignorance, are formations. The Pali is sankharas. The word sankhara has multiple levels of meaning, it depending on context. In its most general sense, sankhara means a conditioned or built up thing. And the root expresses that. It comes from the root of to build or to make. So sankhara is that which is compounded, built, made, constructed. And in its broadest application, it's everything except nibbana. Every conditioned phenomena is a sankhara. So there is the formula that comes up in some of the chanting. It's Sabe Sankhara Dukkha, Sabe Sankhara Anicca, Sabe Dhamma Anatta, which is a very important little formula. Sabe is all. So all sankharas are dukkha, and all sankharas are impermanent. But then the third term changes. It's not Sabe Sankhara, Sabe Dhamma. All Dhammas are not self. Because Dhamma is a more general term than Sankhara. Dhamma means phenomena or object of consciousness. And it includes the conditioned and the unconditioned. It includes nibbana. So nibbana is also empty. But the other two terms, the other two characteristics do not apply to nibbana, but they apply to all sankharas. So sabbe sankhara dukkha, sabbe sankhara anicca, but sabbe dhamma anatta. So that sankhara as a conditioned thing. Then there's a narrower meaning of sankhara, subset. There's sankharas as mental formations. That's the way it's used in the five aggregates. There's the five aggregates of being, body, feeling, perception, consciousness, and mental formations, which is sankharas. And in the dependent origination, it's used in an even narrower sense. It refers to a subset of mental formations, volitional formations. That is mental activity that is volitional, that has a will or direction. In the Abhidhamma, mental states are divided in different ways, and one of them is between those states which are volitional and those which are resultant and those which are functional. The volitional states are those mental states in which we make kamma. This is the important thing. And then resultant states are those in which we receive the results of kamma. And the functional states are just operational states of mind that perform functions in cognition, but they neither make nor receive kamma. So volitional actions originate in the mind. Kamma is made in the mind. If it's expressed through the speech or the body, it's more heavier, has weight, but in those cases it also has to originate in the mind. Anything done without volition doesn't have any kammic effect. The classic example given is stepping on a bug in the dark. If you step on a beetle or an ant in the dark, or if you stomp them deliberately in the daylight, it's different. From the point of view of the bug, it makes no difference. But you're not making any kamma if you accidentally step on a bug in the dark. But if you're doing it deliberately, then that's destruction of life and breach of first precept. So it's a kammically effective act, and that has to originate in the mind. You have to have the mental impulse to perform an action. So this is the making of kamma, and kamma means action. Kamma works as a law. I think it has a close analogy to conservation laws in material physics. You have laws in physics like conservation of angular momentum, which means if you've got a closed system and you perturb one part of it, then other parts will change their action to compensate, to bring the system back into balance. I think angular momentum is the best analogy to kamma. You could use any of the physical conservation laws, but angular momentum seems to be a very neat analogy. Angular momentum means if you've got a closed system in motion, like the motion of planets orbiting a sun, you can measure the angular momentum, meaning the mass times the velocity in the system, and it's always going to be conserved. It's going to be the same. So if something changes in one part of the system, the other part will change to compensate and bring it back to the same value. In physics textbooks, they often give a common example to demonstrate this is a figure skater who's twirling around with her arms out. And if she raises her arms over her head, then she'll speed up. And this is like a trick that they do. And that's conservation of angular momentum, because with her arms out, some of the mass of her body is extended further, so it has a greater distance to travel. And then that term of the equation is changed when you lift your arms over your head. Now the mass is all in the center. So the other term, the velocity, has to increase to keep the result the same. So you perturb one part of a closed system, something else will change to compensate. And this seems to be right across the many different types of conservation of physical quantities, that the universe seems to have a very strong tendency to right itself, to bring itself back to a 0 point. You mess something up over here, something else will compensate over there. And karma is like that. It's like you're perturbing by your actions, which are done out of ignorance. Remember that you're conditioned by ignorance. Whatever, even you do good deeds, it's still based on ignorance, not fully understanding. So you're kind of pushing something out of alignment in the universe. And it makes a little ripple. And then the universe compensates to bring itself back by giving you a resultant. If you do unskillful deeds, you'll get unskillful results. And skillful deeds, you get skillful results. This also depends on the principle that's given at the very first verse of the Dhammapada, that mind is the forerunner, mind is the chief and the origin. Mind comes before body, just as the ox comes before the cart. So what's done in the mind has an effect outside the mind, because the mind is the primary factor. And this is a concept that is alien or uncomfortable to materialist thinking, but it's also one that's, I think, gaining more and more acceptance in the kind of intellectual mainstream. There's more serious thinkers that are proposing various kinds of idealist models. And it's also a point of view that's quite compatible with modern physical conceptions, particularly the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is one of the ways that they try and explain the observer effect. It's discovered experimentally and can be expressed with mathematical precision that many physical effects at the micro level only become real when they're observed. That a particle like a photon or an electron doesn't really have a precise location until it's measured. Prior to that, it only exists as a probability. So they talk about the probability wave. So you can express it as kind of a fuzzy area in space. The proton exists somewhere in this range. And it only becomes a point location when it's observed. So the mind of the observer actually settles the wave function. And this idea of the wave function is very close to the idea of the void, the full emptiness. The idea that everything exists only as a potential. And in the emptiness is universal potential. The sunyata, emptiness, is universal potential. It's infinite potentiality. And when things become manifest, when you have actual objects, discrete objects and events, then that's not an infinite potential anymore. It's a kind of a brokenness. This is dukkha. Anything in manifestation is kind of broken. Because it's lost its infinite potential, now it's only like a little shard. There's the Sarvastivadin idea of the chitta, the knowing mind, as a single moment outside of time, which is the eternal present. And all the other events and objects in the universe are streaming, traveling backwards through time. They exist in the future as infinite potential. And as they move backwards and cross the threshold of the chitta, then they become discrete objects and are known, and then they fade back into the past. So when we make kamma, we're acting out of ignorance and we're perturbing that process somehow. We're shaping the universe with our thought, ultimately. So there's at least a couple of levels in which we create the world we live in. One is through the perception, where we create a simulation of the world based on our sense organs. But the other deeper level is at the level of kamma, where with our thought we actually make kamma and we create the resultants that we experience. In the Buddhist cosmological model, kamma often plays the role of what would be filled by a creator god in other systems. The new universe, when it comes into existence after the destruction of the old universe, is generated of the kamma of the beings from before. So the act of creation becomes a kind of collective action. That the accumulated kamma of the beings require a theater for them to experience their resultants. And a universe is generated. And if we take the modern cosmological model of the Big Bang, at the first moment after the singularity, there's a breaking of symmetry. Now, this is one of the big philosophical questions of all time, is why is there something instead of nothing? At the initial moment of the Big Bang, everything is streaming out equally from the center. How does it end up that the particles end up clumping into galaxies and stars and planets? There was some breaking of the symmetry. If the physical laws as we understand them were just so, there should just be a evenly distributed soup of particles. There was some unknown force causing a breaking of the symmetry. So, because of ignorance, formations, kamma, and all things arise out of that. Form conditioned objects are generated by ignorant minds pushing out into the dark, and creating these partial forms, these fragments from the universal infinite potential. So there becomes something instead of nothing. And something is so much less than nothing ultimately. Then the next term in the dependent origination is because of formations or conditioned by formations, consciousness, vijnana. And there are some suttas where it's just the terms are just stated plainly, baldly, but in other texts they're expanded and there's some bit of explanation. And this is expanded into a patisandhi vijnana, which is rebirth linking consciousness. So it's a particular consciousness that begins the new existence. So it's conditioned by or determined by the kama, the sankharas made in the previous existence. This determines where it's going to arise. When a living being comes to the end of their life, when they die from whatever state of existence they're in, unless they are a fully enlightened one, unless they're an arahant, then even at the moment of death, there remains desire and ignorance and kama outstanding. So consciousness doesn't escape the loop of arising to take an object again. But because the body it has been associated with is no longer functional, the next moment of consciousness has to arise elsewhere. And where it arises will be conditioned by the sankharas made during the previous life. That is, by the kama, by the actions. It will arise someplace appropriate, either in a human form or otherwise. Now there's some debate or controversy within the tradition as to what's called the intermediate state, the antarabhava. What happens between death and birth. And there's a couple of different positions on this. The position of what could be called, what I like to call the high church Theravada, that is the Visuddhimagga and the Abhidhamma, is there is no antarabhava. The moment of death is followed immediately by the moment of birth. Birth not meaning as we mean birth, but conception really. But that's, I think that is an overly scholastic position that almost universally outside that narrow range, there's the idea that there's some kind of transition period. In Tibetan Buddhism, they really elaborate that into the bardos, and they have a whole science of that. But I think the majority of Buddhists in Theravada countries would hold there's some kind of intermediate state, that one exists as something like a ghost or a peta for some time before taking a proper birth, either as a human or as some other type of being. But in any case, whatever transpires in between, at the moment of arising in a new existence, there occurs, in the case of human beings and other womb-born beings, that is most animals, mammals anyway, the new existence begins when the three elements come together, that is the biological elements of the mother and father, the sperm and the egg. And the third element is the consciousness seeking rebirth. Consciousness is the spark that allows the being to unfold. And it seems to be pretty evident just from common experience that children, when we know or have children, watch them grow up, you can see they take certain things from their mother, they take certain things from their father, but they often have some other element that you can't really identify. And you'll see that in families where you have multiple children, that they'll have their own little quirks. And where'd they get that from? There's definitely something from the father, something from the mother, but there's this third thing besides, and that's the heritage is not biological, but is the consciousness spark from their previous existence. And it's one of the three components that unfolds the new being. The development of an embryo in a womb is very much an unfolding process. Very complex, magical sort of dance of the elements of the cells and the organs and everything forming. And it's never fully understood. And there is some element there involved in that beyond just the biological, the purely mechanical. And that's the unfolding of name and form, Namarupa. Namarupa is the next term in the dependent origination, and it's conditioned by this Patisandhi Vijnana. It's the spark that allows this unfolding and guides it. And then you get a emergence of a being, human being or otherwise, with faculties and senses, and this goes into all the rest of the dependent origination. Because of six senses contact, because of contact feeling, because of feeling craving, because of craving clinging, because of clinging becoming, because of becoming birth, sickness, old age, and death, and because of that ignorance. Because if that whole life process has been gone through and an end hasn't been made by a full penetration of reality, that is arahantship, then there's some trace of ignorance left, then this will condition another round of the cycle. It's significant that an arahant, in the Abhidhamma, the arahants are said not to make any karma. Their actions are not volitional, kamic volitional. They don't make karma. Their actions are classed as functional. Because they're not acting out of ignorance, they don't disturb the fabric of the universe. So they're not making any fresh karma. They still experience old karma that they've made before, but often in a very attenuated form, like in the case of Angulimala, who was a mass murderer and a real monster, but then tamed by the Buddha, he became a monk and an arahant. And one time he was on alms round in the village, and village boys verbally abused him, and they threw clods of earth at him, and one cut his forehead and one broke his alms bowl. And he reported this to the Buddha, and the Buddha said, "Bear it, Angulimala, bear it. That's the trace of the last resultant of your karma for all those people you killed. If you hadn't have become an arahant, you would have spent aeons of time in hell for what you did." So the karma was attenuated, unbelievably so, but not eliminated. but they make no fresh karma. Their actions are pure. They're not arising out of or conditioned by ignorance. And because of that, they take no further rebirth. They're done with the conditionality. And what is the state of an arahant after death is something we cannot know, we cannot even conceive of. This is the Buddha's answer to the question, what is the fate of the Tathagata after death? And the tetralemma, the 4 points of the tetralemma. Does the Tathagata exist after death? Does not fit the case. Does the Tathagata not exist after death? Does not fit the case. Does he both exist and not exist? Does not fit the case. Does he neither exist nor not exist? Does not fit the case. Yeah. It's not just difficult, it's actually impossible for us to think about these questions at that level, because our thinking process is conditioned and is bound by the conditioned. So the thinking process can never know the unconditioned. And that's hinted at in the Four Noble Truths, in that the verb used is different. When the Buddha says the first noble truth is to be known, and if I recall correctly, I think he used the word pajanati. And then the third noble truth, it's sometimes translated also as known, but it's patisamvedi is more like penetrated or entered into. So it can't be known, it can't be in the sense of encompassed by the mind, but it can be known in the sense of experience, of entering into it. But then the knower is no longer present. It's like the Christian saying that no man shall look upon the face of God and live. So I think we'll wind it up. Just to recap, the principal point is about the first few terms of the dependent origination. Because of ignorance, we do actions. We create karma. So we're like stumbling in the dark, knocking things over. And these actions condition the consciousness, and in particular, well, throughout existence, they condition consciousness, but of particular importance is the consciousness emerging at the moment of death, the next moment after, the consciousness seeking rebirth, and then this arising in a new existence, alighting in a new place. Consciousness then is the spark that guides the unfolding of name and form, body and mind.